Hey writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Laura, one of Kobo Writing Life's author engagement managers.
And I'm Rachel, Kobo Writing Life's other author engagement manager.
Today we spoke to author Bridget Baker. Bridget won her first writing contest in second grade, and she hasn't stopped writing or talking since then, although she was briefly derailed by her pursuit of a legal career. Ultimately, boring words bored her. She quit her job to spend less time counting gobs of ill-gotten gains and more time writing stories. Bridget knows she should pick one genre and write within it, but she can't seem to choose. With her love of all words, she imagines stories set on Earth as we know it, stories set on Earth as it might be, and stories set on Earth as it might become.
Our conversation with Bridget was hilarious, to be frank. We had so much fun chatting with her, and she was extremely honest about the struggles that she encountered as an indie author who really didn't know much about the industry, and all of the lessons, a lot of which she learned the hard way, that she learned throughout her publishing career to go from an author with a bunch of great ideas and manuscripts to a published, successful, wide author. There's a ton of great information in this episode. I think especially if you're a new indie author, this is a great place to start and to gain some insights into how to start in this industry. And I hope you enjoy.
We're here today with Bridget E. Baker. Bridget, can you start us off by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm pretty much an open book. I am an oversharer. So if you've talked to me at all, you probably already know all this crap. But I have 5 kids, 8 horses, 4 dogs, 2 cats, 30 chickens, and now apparently we're adopting some ducks because there's some disagreement whether they're ducks or Egyptian geese. When I posted it on Facebook, people had very heated opinions. But about a month and a half ago, these 2 ducks showed up in our chicken yard, and they like to roost on the roof. And then sometimes they come in with the chickens at night, and the chickens at first were like, who are these weird, ugly chickens? And then they were like, I guess they're fine. So they're big, and they love that we have a pool. So they are either in our backyard swimming and cleaning and playing in the pool, or they're in the chicken yard playing with the chickens and eating their food.
I love this. I'm a big duck person, huge fan of ducks, so I love this for you.
My buddy Holly hates them, but everyone else likes them. The kids like them. They're nice. You know, I've heard that they can be mean, but the kids go out there and one of them let my daughter pet it. And I was like, I think you might be a baker soon. I don't know how long they're going to stay, but they've been here for 6 weeks. The kids are all kinds of excited that they might have duck babies. And I'm like, that's going to be a spring thing. So I don't know what's going to happen here, but we may or may not have ducks.
Well, how did you get started writing with your zoo of animals surrounding you?
So, it's funny. The zoo of animals actually came after the writing. So I started writing a long time. I'm also a lawyer. And clearly I'm married to a guy who is kind of a saint. And I love to bake and I kickbox and I do all kinds of hobbies. And so I was working as a lawyer and I decided, gosh, this sucks. It's so boring. I was doing a ton of writing anyway. And I thought, you know what, on a lark, I'm just going to write a book. I'm sure it will be great. And so I started writing a book without much idea of what I was writing, except for just writing things I wished would happen. And then about halfway through the book, I was like, you know what would be awesome is if in the middle of this book, the character wakes up and you find out this whole fantasy world was like a dream. And then this lady has all these things to do in the real world. It was literally the worst book ever. And so, but of course, I was convinced that it was, awesome because I'm awesome and I had written this pile of crap. So I proceeded to take it and query it. And basically, if you were to Google search what not to do in a query letter, you would find a list of everything that I tried. So I wrote the query letter in first person point of view from my character. And I'm sure all the agents, and this was back when you had to type it up and print it out and mail these in with a self-addressed stamped envelope. So I literally had hundreds of queries, rejections that came back in my self-addressed stamped envelope that they could have just substituted you're a loser, or if anyone had just been this book is bad. But I was like, well, they said my writing as promised. I'm like, oh, Bridget. Anyway, so I went to this conference in New York, and I think I had maybe 1 baby. So this would have been, my oldest is 17. So it would have been a long time ago. And it was the Backspace Agent Author Seminar in New York. And I feel like at almost every conference I go to, I learn at least one important thing that will help me. That's always my goal. What one critical thing will I learn? And what I learned at that conference was that my book was very bad because I thought that I just couldn't write a good query letter. And I sat down with one of the agents and was walking through it, and they were like, well, what about this and what about that? And I'm like, well, it's not like every book has to have a specific antagonist. And they were like, what? And I was like, well, I mean, like, there are like bad things that happen, but this is just sort of this person is having all these things happen to them. And they were like, and it was in that moment that I was like, oh, shoot, my book's the problem, right? So while I was at that conference, I basically started asking people that didn't suck at writing books, like what books they had learned from to learn to write, because learning to be a good lawyer in your writing and learning to write a good book are very different skill sets. So I started reading craft books, and I kind of voraciously dove into reading craft books to determine that my second pile of crap would not be as smelly. So I read a lot of craft books, many of which were not great, and some of which were great. And so I wrote a second book that was not good either, but was not as bad. And I wrote a third book, and then it was, I think, with my fourth that I finally, and I literally, you know, it's funny because people are always saying, oh, you know, I have tiny kids, I have this, I have that, so I'm going to wait, and I'm going to write later when I have more time. I think that's sort of illusory. I literally wrote this book that became my first published book ever, but it was also the book that landed me my agent. And I had been querying for like 4.5 years with the various crappy books that I had written. So I queried with this one that was not as bad and got an agent. And then we almost sold it. It was my first book to query. It was my first book to pitch. It was my first book to go to acquisitions. And that one didn't sell traditionally. And I was like really bummed because when it went to acquisitions, basically publicity just said, we're not pushing any more dystopian. Like we're full up and we're still putting out series, but we're not acquiring any new dystopian. Like we're just done. And that was sort of the answer that like 4 other publishers had also given my agent. And she's like, I think we need to shelve this book for now. Like maybe we could circle around. And I was like, okay. So I then wrote a book or 2 for her that she didn't like at all. Like I literally sent it to my agent and she's like, I don't really like this. And I was like, but you're my agent. And what should I do to fix it? And she's like, I don't think it's not very good. And I was like, oh, okay. So this is like super depressing. I don't think I wrote for like a month or 2. And then her assistant read it on accident. She was supposed to be reading a good book and apparently inadvertently read my crappy book that my agent thought sucked. And the assistant was obsessed with it and was like, I stayed up all night. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'm dreaming about this book. Who has it been pitched to? And my agent was like, nobody, it's not a good book. And she's like, oh, I disagree. So my agent's like, well, maybe I should pitch it, right? So she very half-heartedly submits this book to a bunch of people. It goes to acquisitions 3 times. And I won't bore you with all of it, but the third time basically was like a mid-range press. It's now a big press. But it went to them at the time, and they offered me like 1/3 of what the other publisher had basically gotten to before the deal fell apart. And they wanted me to change my urban fantasy to a paranormal romance and cut like 70,000 words. It was obviously a little too long. If they could cut 70,000 words to the book. Anyway, but I was like, this is an urban fantasy. I don't want to do a paranormal romance. So I'm going to say no to this $10,000 per book for 3 books. Like that's a no. And my agent's like, if you say no, we're done. And I was like, you know, existential crisis, what do I do? And then I was like, well, I'm not going to put out this book as something that it's not. I guess we're done. She hasn't ever really liked my books. We've been acquisitions 5 times. I've never sold anything. So I walked away. And that was when I met Elena Johnson, which a lot of people know Elena. But she had done trad and put a bunch of books out trad and had a pretty frustrating experience. And she's like, why haven't you considered indie? And I was like, oh, well, indies suck. And she was like, oh, thank you. And I said, well, I mean, the problem is like so much of it is junk. If you do that, you've basically given up. And she's like, the compliments just keep coming. So this is for someone who I didn't know her. I knew that she was Indian. I was like, I don't mean this personally, but like my reasons are I want my books to be good enough or I don't want to put them out. And she's like, okay, I hear what you're saying. I made $300,000 last year. And I was like, oh, tell me more. So that's when I was like, well, maybe I'll try this. Right. And so I took that first book that no one wanted because dystopian's glutted and it sucks and no one wants this. And I decided, you know what, this book is probably not going to be put out traditionally anyway. Why don't I just give it a whirl? I could always use a pen name later if this is a complete disaster, which it of course was. So my story, I could have shortened this whole thing by saying, if you just imagine someone shoveling a bunch of poop, that's like my career. which I have to do. I have 8 horses, so I shovel a lot of poop. And I can tell you there's a lot of similarities between what I do with my horses and also my writing career. So,
and when you started all of this, like you said, you were a full-time lawyer. So what was the transition like from full-time lawyer to full-time writer? When did that happen?
So I was actually full-time until I had my kids. And then I was doing legal work like 20 to 30 hours a week. So my problem was, what I would do was I would hire someone to watch my kids a couple days a week, and I did all legal work, unless I didn't have any legal work, which sometimes I wouldn't. Sometimes it would be backed up and I'd have to work at night to get caught up. And other times, because it was part-time, I didn't have that much to do. So I was like, that's fine. I've already hired the babysitter for the kids. I'll just write in those empty moments. And then I would try and write after my kids were in bed. This is back when I had an agent and, whatever, a book a year was acceptable. When I decided to go indie, when I said instead of, I was actually querying another book because I had written like 4 books that my agent had not even read. I would send them to her and she'd be like, this is another genre? What are you doing? And I'd be like, I don't really know. Here's a book. And she's like, isn't this like our 5th genre together? I'm like, who knows? Why don't you check it out? And so there was all these books I'd sent her. That should have been my first sign, to be honest. If you're sending your agent books and she's like, I'll get to it when I get to it. I'm like, am I on the slush pile with my agent? Anyway, so she's seen the writing on the wall, whatever, is what it is. I also was putting together her submission lists. Like, why don't you send it to these people? How about I do your job for you? And I'll just give you money if we ever get any. So this could also be called Signs Your Agent Partnership is Not Working with Bridget Baker. But anyway, so I decided that I would spend all my time when I didn't have legal stuff writing. And then once I decided to go indie, I had 8 books, okay? 8 books. I'm going to exclude 2 that were complete and total crap, and I just threw those out. But I had 8 that I thought were potentially viable, workable books. The thing is, because I'd been pursuing trad, I had 8 first-in-series books because my agent had said, sensibly, do not write book 2 until book 1 has been accepted. You're going to have to make changes. If you write a second book, who knows? I mean, you could just be going a totally different direction. You're wasting your time. So I have all of these first-in-series series starters, and I'm like, I could just put them all out. Except if you're indie, you really make money by having a series, a lot easier by having a series. And so having a bunch of first-in-series books, people were like, you already have 8 books you can put out. I'm like, sort of. I mean, I have 8 starters that then I would need to finish the whole series. So I actually came in what I would like to say handicapped into the indie game because I came in, and by that I mean like a golf handicap or something. Although I think in golf a handicap might be good. I am not super athletic. So if you have a handicap in golf, that may be good. I'm going to say this was to slow me down. So because I was like, here are all these books. I've given no thought to the marketability or whether anyone really wants them. They're just ideas I had while I was throwing spaghetti against the trad wall. But I like desperately wanted my little babies to come out into the world. So I wanted to put them all out. So I don't even remember what the question was anymore. I'm now just rambling. I'm going to cut myself off. What was I supposed to be saying?
We were talking about the transition from being full-time lawyer to full-time writer.
There we go. So what had happened is at the time I was in-house counsel for a company. I think I technically still am, but I hardly have to do anything for him. This company is one, the guy's a hoot. I thought he was this kind of poor guy, a friend of our family's, and he asked me to do a will for him, and I went over to help him out, like as a friends and family, and he has like a guard in front of his house to get in. And I was like, something is different than when we were in high school, like right next door to each other. What kind of house? You have a guard? And he's like, oh no, my wife just gets nervous. I'm like, so we go inside. It turns out like his little business that he started when I was kids with his daughters, like we were all friends, has done well. And so now he's like wandering around acquiring companies. So he needs someone to basically like handle all the legal stuff that doesn't have to be billed out at $800 an hour for when he like acquires new companies. So anyway, I started doing all of his in-house stuff. And I kind of was able to sort of like shove most of the other legal stuff I had been doing away. And so other than handling that, I sort of, when I decided to go indie, started putting all my time into just doing book stuff, right? I was like, I'm going to handle this in-house stuff when I have to handle it, and then I'm going to try to only do book stuff. So I went from like 20 to 30 hours a week to maybe 10 hours a week of legal time. And that first year, I put out the first book that I had tried to do. And I had told my husband, I'm like, look, if this book can make 10 grand, for each of the books in the series. So like if I'm going to put out a 3-book series, I hope it'll make a $30,000 profit. Then I'm going to call this a success and we'll just keep indie publishing. So I put them out September 15th, October 15th, November 15th. And then I put out my very first, it was supposed to be a holiday romance novella because everyone at the time was telling me how well these did. You just need a holiday romance novella. It's super quick. It's fast to write. So I sat down to write my 30,000 word holiday romance novella and wrote a 90,000 word romance that was all first person only from the girl's point of view. I knew what I was doing clearly. And so I had put that out too. And all under the same name. I had a YA dystopian and then this random not novella that I put out that year. And I spent about $5,300 between covers and editing to put them out. I ran no ads. I had no idea. I'm like, people will gobble this up once it's out. They'll just find out about my books and want to read them. And so I had a mailing list of like 150 of my family and friends I had managed to convince to give me their email, or I had pulled from my own email, which is probably legal-ish. And so I was off to a good start, and I made about $1,500 after spending like $5,500. So things were going well. I was almost at the $10,000 per book. I needed to be at $40,000. I had lost $3,500. So I told my husband around Christmas time, I'm all done. Like, I'm not doing this anymore. This was a major failure. I lost $3,500 for the privilege of putting 4 books out that no one will ever read. And now I have to use a pen name because Bridget E. Baker sucks now. And so, and I was like, I'm all finished. And he said, don't you have some friends who are like running ads though? And I was like, yeah, that's a whole thing I don't want to deal with. And I don't really understand. So that's a no. They didn't just get gobbled up. I think that we're just going to call this done. And he's like, I think before you quit, you should probably take a class in how to run advertisements. And I was like, ugh. So I signed up another $1,000 down the drain. And I'm like, now I'm underwater, $4,500 for 4 books. And so I took an ads class. And that month I ran, I think like $1,700 in ads and made like a $2,000 profit or something. So I ended up making like $3,500 back or somewhere around there. I mean, I'd have to look up the numbers to know for sure, but I turned a profit just for that month. I was not profitable, but for that month I was profitable. And I'm like, people know my books! Facebook ads are awesome! Like, and of course at the beginning, when you decide to go indie, I feel like it's like, if you've ever been in a situation, maybe think back to when you first learned to drive and you were like, the person who's teaching you, in my case, my mom, who was like clutching the arm thing, like she was practically going to die if she didn't have this arm thing. I'm like, Mom, that will not save you if we are driving and get into an accident. In fact, it'll probably just break your fingers. But anyway, she's like this, and she was very reactive. Everything that I did. But when we were driving, she'd be like, Bridget, the blinker, Bridget, your brakes, Bridget, 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 Bridget. This is how I felt when I started indie publishing. It was like, oh my gosh, are you in KU or are you wide? What is wide? What is KU? What are we talking about? Kindle Select, Kindle Unlimited. Are you doing this thing? Do you have the whatever? Are you formatting in Vellum? Are you formatting yourself? Are you doing them? I felt like as soon as I decided to go indie, it was like someone was throwing all these questions at me. Answer these questions. And I can't ask you anymore until you answer this. Oh, now we got more. Have you bought your ISBNs? Have you set up your website? Do you have a newsletter? Who are you using for your newsletter service? How did you find these people? When are you sending your newsletters? I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm making all these decisions. And it got to the point where I was like, literally any question you ask, if it narrows the number of decisions I have to make down, then that's the one I want. What's the easiest? Because I am so confused. So I didn't even really look into what wide meant. I just was like, okay, you means just Amazon, that one. And so I signed up for it and went straight into, I mean, I don't think anyone even talked to me about not being in KU. They were like, then you have to do like all this stuff if you don't do KU. I'm like, oh, well then, I mean, I like Netflix, KU it is, you know. And so I started out there. And it wasn't until people started hurling questions at me like audiobooks and, you know, where are you going to put your audiobooks that I was like, what are the other options? You know, but I had been doing it for a little while. And I figured out that first year how to turn a profit. So I went from losing $3,500 in the first 3.5 months that I had books out to the second calendar year. I think I made about a $55,000 profit, which was not huge, but it felt huge compared to losing money. I was like, I mean, I still thought it was a failure because 55,000 would have been 5.5 books. And I think I put out 7 books in my second year. And I put out 4 the first year. So really, you know, doing my math, I should have had 110 grand and I'd only made 55. So it was like a failure. But at the time, it was an improvement. So I was like, it's better. I've made some progress. But I sort of stopped doing anything but the 8 to 10 hours of legal work a week I had to do then, and have never looked back. And I've pretty much gotten it down to about 15 or 20 hours a month of legal work at this point. And it sort of stayed there. But like managing my kids, my husband's an ER doctor, so his schedule's super erratic, and he works out of town when he works. So I'm sort of like on tap for holding down the fort for everything. Like all the kids' activities, their meetings, their appointments. Like people will be like, hey, why don't we do this at like 3:30 or 4? I'm like, you don't understand. From 3:30 when I pick up my kids until 9, blackout time. Like I can't do anything then. I'm busy.
So I'm really curious because you've talked a lot about how, when you started, you were in KU, you were throwing spaghetti at the wall. You were trying to figure out what worked and how to turn a profit. And now you are one of the largest advocates for publishing wide. You are a successful wide author. When did that turn happen for you?
That's a good question. What's interesting is when I went from losing money on my books to making money, I thought this was a big improvement. It wasn't where I wanted to be, but I was happy with it. And so that year, so 2018 is when I put out those first 4. 2019, I think I put out 7 or 8 books, all in KU. 2020, at the end of 2019, I decided I had a company come to me and want to get the rights to license one of my book series, that very first one. They wanted the audio rights. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to mess with audio. I don't know anything about audio. I've never listened to an audiobook. Sure, you want to give me $1,500? Here you go. And so I was like, have my audio rights, and then as I started getting my royalty statements, I was like, wait, if I had done this myself, I would be making this, but because you guys did it, I'm making this. I should do my own audio, right? And so then I had a lot, then it's like questions again, right? So they're asking me all these questions. And one of the biggest ones for me was, and keep in mind, Laura and Rachel, I think you guys know this, but probably the listeners may not. My books are self-described as hamburcheladas. So my books are odd. Most people, if you're like, hey, would you like to read a werewolf shifter romance? They're like, oh, yes or no. Or they're like, yeah, I like that or I don't. But you know what it is? You're offering someone a taco. You're like, here, why don't you try this taco? It's got mango salsa on it. And they're like, oh, I hate mangoes. Oh, okay, well, this one's not for you. Let's leave the mango salsa off. Here you go. But they know what it is. My books are like, imagine if you had like Game of Thrones, but then like it's set on Earth. So like wonder, and it's also matriarchal, but like, it's like a clean Game of Thrones meets Wonder Woman. And they're like, that took you a really long time to pitch. I'm like, it's actually a lot more complicated. Let me explain. Also, books 2, 4, and 6 are villain stories. So they're a totally different character that you absolutely hate at the end of the book right before. And people are like, what are you talking about? So I have these books in KU, right? And I have to spend so much money in my ads to try and explain to them what this weird thing is. They'll give it a try. And then I only get paid $1 a book. But it was fine because I was spending like $1 and making like $1.60. And that doesn't sound very good, but to me, it was good. I was making a profit. And so I decided at the end of 2019, after getting my first statement basically on my audio, I said, I'm going to get the best audio I can get because I had a couple of weird books that had won a couple of awards. I had gotten a starred review when I submitted my books to Kirkus, and that happened after, but I had won a couple of awards and I was like, I think these books are okay. I don't want a crappy narrator because I'll have this book forever. And I'm planning on continuing to do this stupid thing that I'm not making much money at. I took a huge pay cut as a lawyer to not sell books. So I was like, I want to actually get really good audio. So I went and interviewed people and found someone that I loved, knowing absolutely nothing about audio. So you can see that I was set up for success. Anyway, but I did actually find a good narrator, I think. And she was expensive. And I was like, it's fine. It's okay if it even takes a year to pay them off. So I went ahead and started putting out, because why start with just one? I decided to put 2 series out at the same time in audio. So I committed, I'm going to start this romance one. I'm going to start this fantasy one. Then they didn't sell at all. Of course I put them Audible exclusive because that's what everyone did. 80% of all audio sold Audible. So why would you take 25% instead of 40%? Put it there. And so I was like, oh, this wasn't even a question. They just told me I'll put it here. So I put it there and I literally logged in one day and I check my numbers kind of obsessively and I had like 162 sales and I only had 3 audiobooks out, I think. I didn't have very many. And so I was like, okay, great, 162. I logged in to check on a book later and I had 60 sales. And I was like, how did I lose 102 sales in 2 hours? Like, what the crap happened? So I immediately email them and get on Facebook, and I'm like, what's going on? And everyone checks, and they're like, whoa, I lost a ton of sales. So when we finally heard back from Audible a week later, they basically explained that they batch process returns typically, but that day they just had a glitch. And so they processed an entire week's returns at the same time. And I was like, I'm losing, like, let's do the math. I had 162 sales. I lost 102 sales. That's 1 week's worth of returns. Screw you. So like, I immediately sent them a bunch of letters. I'm a lawyer. And I was like, I'm a stay-at-home mom with nothing but time. I'm going to sue the crap out of you. And I'm going to go to all the other authors, and they're all going to sue you, and you're going to go down. Right. I mean, I was furious. I was like, let my books the F out of here. And sorry, I don't know if I can say the F, but anyhow, I'll double down by saying it twice. So anyway, so I got my books out. And what's funny is they let me out about 2 months before they let everybody else out. They were like, get rid of this lady. She's like an angry bee. So I get out, and I immediately go to Findaway, and I'm like, take my books. And they were like, okay. And then a couple months later, I go to Nink, and they're literally offering 1 year's worth of revenue difference between Audible exclusive and Audible at the 25% to anyone who's, I'm like, I already signed up. So I'm frequently a very stupid early adapter. But anyway, when that happened, I was like, I do not trust Amazon to have my best interests at heart. I just don't. And so I immediately joined all the wide groups and sent them the notice and said, get my books out of KU. And they surprised me by emailing back and saying, we'll just take them all out. And I was like, oh, good. Yeah, okay. And so they were all out, like within 2 days of me sending them. I think, I don't know whether there might have been an email from Audible, like, let this woman out, she's a lunatic. But anyway, so I was like immediately wide. I had no idea what I was doing. And that was when I was like, you know what, I think what I'm going to do. And at this point, I had made about $75,000 profit in that like previous 12 months. So it was better than, you know, and I attributed that to just having more books out. I think they were doing about the same, but I was making a little more. And everybody told me, you don't go wide for money. Don't go wide for money. And honestly, every time I heard that, I was like, I mean, I'm going wide because I'm freaking pissed off. But I'm pissed off because they're taking my money. So I was like really confused. I'm like, this is a business. So if I'm not going wide for money, why am I going wide? Like, so people would say that, and it made me very concerned. I was like, I was like, I'm going wide for money security, okay, but also for money, right? Like, it's a business. So that kind of baffled me. But when I went wide with everything, cold turkey, the second they would let me out, I was in the middle of finishing that weird 7-book fantasy series I was telling you about. And so I had to put out books 6 and 7. And I decided that I would go ahead and put them in KU for like, I thought I had to leave them in for 90 days. So I put the first one in, and then 3 weeks later, I put the second one in because they released, like, those books released 3 weeks apart. And then I emailed them 2 weeks after that and was like, can we take these books out? And they're like, yes. And they were out the next day. So in my defense, I thought it was going to take time that it did not take. But I had a lot of readers who were really angry because they're like, I read the first 5 books in this in KU, and maybe they got the 6th because it was there for like almost a month. But the last book was only there for like 2 weeks. So I had a bunch of 1-star reviews saying, this is a money grab. And I wanted to be like, isn't all publishing a money grab? I mean, I'm actually only doing this to grab your money. Otherwise, I would be like watching TV or like binge eating or baking or something. I wouldn't be like poring over stories and editing. I'd like to say that I would. I do like what I do, but also it is my job. So like if people stop paying me, I'm going to be like, dude, I guess I'll tell my kids some cool stories. Peace. So, you know, maybe that makes me sound greedy. I put those 2 books out wide, and then they had to buy them on Amazon. So what's funny is my revenue went from like a solid $5,000 or $6,000 a month profit to like 7 or 8 right as soon as I went wide, because they had to buy these books that they were getting for $1. So instead of, you know, getting them for $1, I was making $4. And I had quite a few people that wanted to finish the series in spite of the fact that they hated me and wanted me to die. They then bought those last 2 books. So my going wide transition was actually quite nice. Not necessarily in the being loved, but in the making money. My money almost doubled for the 2 months after I went wide. And that's when I reached the point that I was like, I now don't know what to do. I'm wide, and the ads that I used to be able to run to basically say, get my books for free, because they were all in KU, I was like, that's not going to work, because now it's buy them for $5.99 a piece. And so I tried running a few ads, and they weren't doing so hot. And I think my first month, I looked it up a couple of weeks ago because I was trying to figure out like my numbers and where I'd gone. My first month on Kobo, I made like $11. And I think my second month, I made like 12 or 14. I mean, it was an improvement. And then after that, it went down and I made like 8. And I was like, this is going nowhere for me. And that was pretty much true across the board. I don't know if you guys hear about this kind of stuff like industry news, but I went wide right as Barnes & Noble got hacked. So I like put one of my books up, but not all the others, just one. And I got a BookBub featured deal on it, and I had no way to price adjust because I was like, I can't get into my dashboard. And I remember being like super sad. I'm like, my one shot, my BookBub feature, and I won't be able to make anything on Nook. And now I'm like, okay, but really one platform, one BookBub deal, like, I mean, it's going to help, but it's not going to be transformational. But I'm like, I don't know if you can tell, I'm like a ridiculous optimist. So I'm the kind of person who before every release is like, this is going to be the book. No one has wanted to read them before, but they are going to flock to this one, right? Like, I always think this is the Hamburchelada people are going to be like really excited for. And so like, anytime I got my first BookBub and I like could not sleep the night before, could not sleep. I'm like, my book's going to take off. Maybe Oprah will see it. Maybe I will be on there soon. This is going to change everything. And then, my BookBub deal comes and I give away some copies and I'm like, yay, I made like a couple $100. Oh. And then I'm back to just normal. This may not be my only strategy. So I had to like kind of learn, what do I do? And it took me a couple of months because I'm stubborn to try a perma-free. And that has been my strategy with my Hamburcheladas ever since. If it's super weird and people don't know if they want it, at least make the first book free. Let them see if they like the Hamburchelada, then maybe they'll buy more later.
I love the Hamburchelada name.
Honestly, I'd eat one.
It does sound good. It sounds good.
But messy. It sounds messy. I'm like, I feel like if I tried to eat, I'm messy enough with a hamburger. Don't put more sauce on it. I'm going to like ruin my clothes. I'd need a bib.
You talked a little bit about your numbers and how often you check in on them. One of the things that we love about you is how open you are with sharing that information and those numbers with other authors. Why is it important for you to share that info, be so open about it?
So here's the thing, and it's funny because we actually, a good author friend of mine who I adore, just did a big post where she basically said she thinks it's kind of inappropriate for authors to get on and share their numbers. And I commented, and I was like, listen, it's funny because she was like, I knew you were going to come at me after that. And I'm like, no, look, here's the thing. Remember the conversation that I told you I would not have even considered indie because to me, from everything I read online, going indie was like surrender. It was like, I guess my books aren't very good, so I'll just blob them out myself. I didn't see it as a viable option until Elena was like, that's fine. I mean, it's cool. I made like 10 grand a book on my first trad titles, but I made $300,000 profit last year. And I was like, come again? Because for me, that was when I was like, oh, this isn't just throwing a book out there and hoping that you can like sit awkwardly at a Barnes & Noble and make people cringe at you while you try to get them to look at the books on your sad little table, which would be like, if you're like, what's Bridget's worst nightmare? Sitting awkwardly at anywhere with my books, trying to get people to buy them, shoot me in the head. I'm an extrovert. That would be hell. Like, I cannot do that. And that was literally what I thought of when I thought indie. I was like, peddling your books to people? I can't think of anything more horrifying. So I share numbers for 2 reasons. Number one, I feel like in a lot of author groups, there's a lot of opinions and advice given. I've said this before, and this sounds mean, and I don't mean it to say that those people are not valuable, that they're not good, that their books aren't good. I'm not saying that at all. But I wish there was a little button when people gave advice that said, I make $300,000 a year profit. I don't give a crap what your gross is. And the reason I don't give a crap what your gross is I could go in right now and make $2 million this year pushing my books if I just need to break even. I want to know how much profit you made because I don't care what your gross ended up being. I want to know what you got to bring home. And the reason is, to me, that's success, right? So, because like I said, this is a business. So I'm very transparent on my numbers because I want people, there are plenty of people, and I mean a lot of people, probably not a ton listening, but maybe some listening to this to try and learn who make more than me. I don't know. There are plenty of authors who make more than me. They don't need to take advice from me because they're already doing something right. Now, Elena, my best friend, makes a lot more than me, but she listens to my advice on a lot of things because there are little ways in which I optimize my oddball books that she can do with her more marketable books and make even more money than what I'm doing. So I think that you can learn valuable things from anyone at any level, but I think that I'm more inclined to listen to someone when I can say, oh, that's working. If someone's telling me how to build a house and the house that they built is a dog house, I'd like to know that relevant information before I start taking their advice and putting in my own septic. So like, to me, that's what the numbers provide. They can look at that and say, dude, I make 3 times what she does. I'm going to move along. Or they can say, man, I'm lucky to have a $300 month. Maybe I should listen to what she's doing. Maybe it will work for me. And I'm also very clear that my books are oddballs. So like, it makes a difference. I have a friend who can literally just have anybody throw up Facebook ads for her and they turn a profit because her books are hella marketable. Mine aren't. So if you have books that are hard to market, one of my friends, Victorine, she's a hoot. She told me once, I always try to market a book until I decide whether it feels like I'm trying to float a rock. And at the time I was like, what does she mean float a rock? And then I actually got a series that was easy to market. And I'm like, holy crap, I have floated nothing but rocks for 3 years. This is my first non-floating a rock release, right? And I was like, gosh, dang it. So sometimes you don't understand what the advice means until the game changes a little and you're like, dang. So I'm very transparent on my numbers because I feel like it's the only way that people can evaluate and suss out what advice works. And I also think that there may be other people like me who are putting off doing something that would be a huge blessing for them in their life because they don't have enough information to know that it would be a huge blessing. And frankly, indies don't get, the same type of recognition. We don't get the same type of awards. We don't get the same type of push or placement in a bookstore. So in a large way, sharing our numbers is the only way for us to say, hey, this is working. Because I'm not going to get like a pat on the back from Oprah. Even though I really thought that might happen a few times, it never has. And you know who
Not
else?
yet.
No love whatsoever from, why am I saying
Reese Witherspoon?
So far, none. But it's funny though, because I do get readers and family and friends who regularly message me and they're like, you know what you should do? Have you ever considered going on Oprah? Have you ever thought about sending Reese Witherspoon one of your books? I'm like, dude, who is it again? Let me write her name down. I'm going to look this up. I'm like, yes, thank you. Good tips. Good tips all around.
It's like that meme, like, why don't you just call Taylor up? And
all these people that are like, oh my gosh, Taylor is indie publishing. I'm like, no, when you're already the queen, that's not really indie publishing. That's just keeping all your money. But good job for her, indie publishing against all odds. She's just going out there, slay queen. And I like Taylor, but I'm like, that is not indie publishing. Anyway.
I'm trying desperately to give Taylor more of my money to go see her in Toronto this month. But anyways, off topic.
But it costs too much there. You have to go to Europe again.
I know. It's so tough.
Only go to option. Try Austria or like Spain. Oh, no, wait. Where did you go last time?
I went to Lisbon to see the Eras tour. Yeah.
There you go.
Like a responsible adult. But anyways, I absolutely love the transparency that you have, like Laura mentioned, and kind of like you alluded to, a lot of folks don't understand that indie publishing is such a lucrative and viable business when you treat it like a business. Like, yes, writing is a craft. It is an art form. You need to hone your craft in order to sell books, but you also need to run your publishing, like your own publishing house, to be a successful indie author. And it's a lot of work, but like you have mentioned, it can be a very lucrative career.
Yeah, and I also feel like, because I mentioned that when I went into those wide groups, like Wide for the Win, for instance, on Facebook, it seemed like every post was about, you shouldn't be doing this for money. I honestly post in there because I want to tell people, you should be doing this for money. Like, even if maybe your money will stay the same, but it should be more stable. So each month, I'll have good months and bad months at Amazon. I'll have good and bad months at Kobo. I'll have good and bad months at Findaway on my audio. Like, that stuff just swings, and it just does. And I will not have a featured promo every month, and I won't have one at each site every month. But overall, when I have multiple places where I'm able to find revenue, that stabilizes my income. And what was interesting is when I looked at my income when I was in KU, and admittedly, it's been a long time, and I only had a handful of books. So, I had a friend who was like, you don't really know, you might be making even more if you'd stayed in KU. I'm like, that's absolutely true. When people would ask me with babies, do you like Milacon drops, which are like these drops that are supposed to reduce colic? I'd be like, Who knows? Because my babies would have good nights and fussy nights when I wasn't giving them Mylicon drops, and then I give it to them. I don't know. At the end of the day, for me, my revenue has gone up consistently and been much more stable. When I looked at my graph when I was in KU, I would have big months where an ad took off and bad months where it just was like flatlined. And I had some months where I only made a $4,000 profit, and I had others where I made $7,000 when I was in KU. I have been very consistent. I mean, I'll certainly have big months where I make a lot, but my baseline numbers last year in 2023, my lowest, crappiest month, I still got $19,000 profit. And I mean, like, it was consistent. I mean, almost every month I was over 20. That was January. January of last year was the first month where I didn't quite hit 20, but every other month I was over. And this year so far, I've had 1 month where I wasn't at 20 and I was still close. And that's just being consistent. I still have big promos where I have like a new release or something that people actually want, which is rare for me, but has happened. And so when that happens, then, you have a better month on those months. But the consistency has been because it's data aggregated over multiple different revenue streams instead of relying on just one. Like, I'd see my friends in groups panic because something changed with the KU page read formula, or they'd panic because Amazon's doing such and such, or, oh my gosh, someone pirated my book. And one of my good friends was actually kind of freaking out because someone had pirated her book on Apple and blah, 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 and da-da-da-da. And she's like so mad at Apple because they didn't get it down fast enough. And I was like, that's not actually an Apple problem. Like, yes, I mean, get it down. Are they really selling lots of copies? Probably not. I said, Apple will get to it. And she's like, if they don't get to it fast, Amazon will take down my author account. And I said, that's an Amazon problem. Like, if they are punishing you for the actions of other people when you're the victim, they need to fix that policy. That's not Apple being the villain. That's Amazon being the villain. Let's not gaslight other places that you can sell books, because Amazon has these draconian policies that punish authors. So I just like being able to adapt and basically be involved in everything. And one of the nice things I've been able to tell people, actually, because on ads a lot, people will say, why aren't you these books in KU? And I'll say, well, KU doesn't allow me to be anywhere else, but you can read them on a fixed price plan if you'd like to on Kobo. And so I send a lot of people over because you guys have a subscription plan that is reasonable, that is solid, and where I actually get paid if someone rereads it. I have some friends who are complaining and they're like, our readers are telling me that they read this book 6 times last year. It's their comfort read. Of course, I only got paid once because it's page reads. And I was like, if you were on Kobo, you would have gotten paid 6 times because it's minutes read, which is a better plan. But I think, to me, it's been way more consistent, way more stable to have wide income. I still moved wide for the money, and I've stayed wide for the money.
And with so many new things popping up in the industry, like TikTok, Patreon, everything like that, do you feel kind of a constant pressure to jump on the latest trend?
So I know a lot of people who deal with FOMO. I am not one of them. I have many things that make me a trying person to deal with, I'm sure. I'm sure my husband could give you a lot. I'm always right, for one, and that's very difficult for people who are wrong sometimes. But I do not suffer from FOMO. So I would say I'm like always a late adapter. If people are doing stuff, I think TikTok had been out and everyone had told me, maybe you should try TikTok, about 1 billion times before I was like, I guess I'll download this app. Think of me like your 85-year-old neighbor. I'm like, I guess once everyone has it, if my mom is using it, I should probably get on and try it, right? Like, I'm not someone who's like, oh, they're doing this, I should do it. All these people are like, get on Threads, it's a new thing. I'm like, oh my gosh, a new thing, why? Why is there another new thing? I hate all the new things. So I don't like to learn new crap. I don't want to learn new crap. So I don't get FOMO. I kind of wait and let people, so like, I'll give you an example. Vela comes out and half of my friends are like, oh my gosh, Vela! And I'm like, have you tried Radish? Because it doesn't pay very well and it's time intensive and you're constantly having to interact with fans and you can't just put out your book in another format. You have to do it first because they're divas and you have to do little tiny series and little things and you want people to heart them and like them. I'm like, this sounds awful. I want nothing to do with that. I have a couple of book series on Radish and they sort of muddle along and do nothing. Pass on an exclusive Radish? No. And so I did nothing with it. And maybe I would have made a ton of money on there. Maybe. But I wasn't too worried about it. I never put my stuff in. And guess what? Bella folded up shop. I think they needed a little hamburger chilada in there and they didn't get any. So I put them under. Late adapter. I don't get FOMO. I kind of feel like the party is where I am. And so if I'm not there yet, how good can it really be?
I love that attitude. I need to adapt that in like my entire life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of like the quote for the episode.
Absolutely.
Party is where I'm at. That's the attitude we all need.
Yeah. Now, I know we've talked a lot about kind of marketing and your career, but one thing I wanted to talk to you about, and I've warned you that I was going to ask you about this, is one year when we were chatting at NINC, you talked about how you are a very strict plotter. You have kind of a plotting formula that helps you write pretty prolifically. Like you, released 46 books in under 6 years, which is bananas. But I was wondering if you could kind of give us like a very high level overview of your plotting process, because I know it is quite intricate and you can talk about it for hours, but unfortunately we do have a time limit here.
So I actually, Elena convinced me, I think she wanted me to come with her to this conference. And so she like badgered me into figuring out how to do it. I used to teach it in like a 6 1-hour parts. And then she wanted me to teach it in an hour. And I was like, I can't do that. And I did manage to squeeze it all into an hour. But my plotting process, remember, well, I don't know if I did that on the recording or before we started, but when I was trying to figure out how to write, I voraciously consumed a lot of craft books.
Yeah.
And so I have the same kind of philosophy on conferences, on reader retreats, on craft books. What I want to do is gain one good thing from it. And there were plenty of craft books I read where I felt like I gained nothing from it. But several of them were basically transformational. My plotting process is basically the process that I put together through reading and I guess aggregating the helpful things I got from all of the craft books that I really loved. So the first step before you can come up with a plot, in my opinion, is going through and reading any kind of book on plotting, story, structure. And so one that I really like is Story Engineering by a guy named Larry Brooks. But of course, Save the Cat is fine. There are a whole bunch of different ones. They're all fine. It's going to give you a good idea. It will ruin all movies for you, but it will make you a much better writer. You'll be watching a movie and be like, oh, this is the first plot point. Oh, here comes the midpoint. Okay, this is when the main character is actually going to get involved and start doing crap instead of sitting around like a fop. My kids now all know because I homeschooled them during COVID. So they're like, Mom, here comes the midpoint. I'm like, there's the midpoint. They're like, here's all is lost. I'm like, all is lost. Good job. You guys remembered some of that stuff. So they're like, yeah, you ruined movies for us forever. I'm like, you're welcome. My job here is done. But anyway, so basic rubric of story, get that down. And then my second thing, and this is what I get from people all the time, new writers especially are always asking me, how long should my chapter be? If you're asking me how long your chapter should be, you do not yet understand how to write a book. And what I mean by that, there's a guy, and I have his book here somewhere, but there's a guy named Robert McKee, and he's basically like the screenplay god. He like essentially invented screenplay at UCLA. And I think he may still teach there. But anyway, he has this screenplay Bible. It's called Story, Story, super simple title, by Robert McKee. And the main thing, that book is amazing, but get it in hard copy because I had to read it 2 or 3 times, and I'm not trying to brag, but I'm pretty smart. And so you might want it in hard copy. But anyway, the two most important things that come from that's really one principle. Every chapter or scene or whatever you want to call it needs 2 things. The first thing it needs is an emotional value change. That is, the person is going to have a goal. Everybody knows goal, motivation, conflict, I hope. I did not when I wrote my first book, but everyone should know goal, motivation, conflict. Okay, the character's going to have a goal. That's probably not what they really need, but they think it is. So they're trying to get closer to it. And so in each chapter, that emotional value term just means they get closer or they get further away. Okay, so good to better, bad to worst, good to bad, bad to good, any of these things, but somehow they're getting closer or further from their goal. And then the second thing, and that needs to happen at the end, like you're building it in the chapter and then there's a turn at the end emotionally. And the second thing that needs to happen is a gap. And that gap is basically the space between what the reader or the character, either one, thinks is going to happen and then what does. So like the classic one would be like setting up, okay, this poor lady, she's really tired. She's basically a single mom because her husband is deployed. He's in Iraq and the whole day's gone to crap. The kids are a problem, whatever. And she decides she's just going to order pizza. So she's still dealing with all these problems. And she's like, the kids are hungry, where's the food, blah, blah, blah. And then this other thing happens and she's dealing with it. And then the doorbell rings. So of course the reader has been primed by the writer to believe, okay, she's had a bad day. So we're bad, right? And we're thinking it's going to go bad to good. The kids' pizza's here. Finally, something great is going to happen. But when she opens the door, it's not pizza. It's a police officer letting her know that her husband died or whatever. So you've gone bad to worse, right? You have this emotional value turn because her bad day got even worse. And then you have this, gap because we were expecting pizza. So you can set that up as a writer, what their expectations are, and you can either surprise the character or the reader, or a lot of times, usually both, right? So that's what I put in every chapter. I don't have a chapter unless I have those things. So when people say like, I don't know which things to cut, I'm like, does it have an emotional value turn for the main character? Is there a gap? If you don't have those things, cut it, right? And then the other main thing that I learned, so I learned all these things and I assemble all this information about the characters, the main characters, and then I take that story structure I told you need to learn and I stretch it across like a frame, like I'm stretching out leather or something. And so the other thing that I learned that was really big, there's a book called Story Genius by a lady named Lisa Crone. That taught me something important because I originally believed, and if you were to read my first series that starts with Marked, my Sins of Our Ancestors series, you would see that I did not yet know this when I wrote that series. I believed you have to have character growth, which you do. And so I didn't really know how to elegantly do character growth. So I just sort of made her a little bit obnoxious and kind of stupidish and like immature. And then she grew during the series. What's the problem? The obvious problem is the most important part of any book is the first 10 pages. Because if you lose people because your character is annoying, or if you lose people because, even though she saw her dad be murdered and the world is ending and now she's been marked with a post-apocalyptic virus, like she's too freaking whiny. And I'm like, okay, you're right though, readers, because you would probably be like, bring on the parade, I got this, I got some mad skills. You would not be crying or whining. But even though all this bad crap happened, readers have very low tolerance for whining of any kind. If they're not basically Superman, they don't want to read about it. So good luck getting some character development for Superman. Lisa Crone tells you how. And what she does is she talks about how your character needs to have a misconception. And so, because people, even if it's fantasy, they want to feel like they're learning something from what they've read. And even if that's just reaffirming something they already know, that's good enough. So what you do is you have the character have this defining misconception, this thing that they misunderstand about the way the world is. And if the people reading it can truly learn something too, they're even more satisfied. But you can give them this, like a good example of that is House. If you've ever seen the TV series House, that guy's obnoxious as crap, but he's really smart. So he's not really learning a lot, but he does have to learn the cost of being caustic, right? Like he's really awful to people and there are costs associated with that. He does have to learn sometimes why he's overlooking things or how his pride gets in the way or whatever. A number of different things he'll learn. That's what the reader is also learning. And also they're thinking about how smart they are because they knew all along that guy was too prideful. I mean, I'm nothing like that, right? Like as I sit here in pride telling you how I already know everything. So these are the basic foundation blocks. And then there's a really awesome book that if you're an indie and you haven't read this, shame on you. Go buy this book. It's by Theodora Taylor. I think it's T. Taylor, and it's called like Universal Fantasy. It has nothing to do with you can use it for fantasy, but it breaks down for you what people want when they're reading escape fiction. And it helps you to figure out, how do I add these elements to my book so people will want to read my books? And she literally discovered it by figuring out, like, how come these books sell and these ones don't? So you want to read that to make sure that when you're coming up with your plot, you're including some universal fantasy, some stuff that people want when they're like escaping, right? Even though sometimes you might feel bad. Like, so I wrote this story, it's my bestseller, and I told my husband's family I was going to be writing it. And they were like, you're writing a book about a woman who lives in Texas with 4 kids. I have 5, so it's clearly not me. Who is a lawyer, whose wonderful, perfect, happy marriage husband dies, and then she gets to get a new husband. I'm like, dude, you guys need to chill. It's clearly not autobiographical. She has 4 kids. Did they read the 4 kids? So they're all like upset. And I'm like, listen, this is a universal fantasy. I want to experience the joy of finding love again, but I'm happy in my marriage, right? But sometimes I'm like, pick up your freaking socks. So like, I want to be like it wasn't my fault. He died, right? So now it's okay if I go somewhere. Or alternately, it's not my fault. I fell back into the 1600s and met a super hot Highlander. What do you want from me? So like, that's where you kind of figure out how to set these up so that your readers are happy and can be fill-ins without their family thinking they're a dirty, dirty work. So that's like the universal fantasy element. And then I think the last thing that I would point you at, and basically I assemble all these things together. And it's funny because when people are like, oh, you put your outline together, I'm like, it doesn't even really matter how long the outline is. It's that I'm going to have several pages on each of my main characters about, the book series is going to have universal fantasy stuff and sort of a plot. These things are going to happen. Then my characters, I'm going to have this wound, goal, motivation, conflict. And then I'm going to have like the defining misconception about them. And then I'm going to have, when I start getting chapter to chapter, I'm going to incorporate those gap and turn and, the universal fantasy elements. But then the last one, and this was actually, I think, my biggest weakness as a writer. So this was sort of transformational for me. There's a lady that I love. Her name's Brene Brown, and she's a fellow Houstonian. But anyway, I was literally listening to a TED Talk that she gave on shields, and it had nothing to do with books. But as I was listening, I'm like, there had been a question I had been asking myself, and I had read so many books on this, and none of them answered it. There's a guy named Donald Moss, who is a talented agent. I am not in any way slamming him as an agent, but his book sucked on character. It was like, let me ask you 9,000 questions about this character, and you'll know like what their first grade teacher was, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, this is all useless. I don't need to know that crap about him. Like, I just need to write a story. Also, I don't have 17 hours to like plot out each character before I start writing. Hello. And that tells me nothing about which things I need to actually put in my story. Where do I start it? None of this is helpful. So Brene Brown is in this thing, and she answered the question that I've had, which is, why do some characters who have experienced the exact same trauma and maybe come from the exact same background, white Houstonians with 4 or 5 kids, experience the same trauma and react so differently? That's what I wanted to know, because that's what makes your character internally consistent. You have to understand, why are they going to react that way? And that way, any other trauma you're throwing at them, because let's be honest, as fiction writers, we're basically creators of trauma, right? We're just like hurling trauma at our characters and then watching them endure it. As like, a fill-in, like, I don't have to go through this crap. Look what you have to do, So then the question is, how do I make them consistent? And this is what Brene Brown said. She said, every human protects themselves. We talk about vulnerability, like when you're open and you say, hey, these are things, right? Every human protects themselves in one of, she said 6 ways. I actually think there's a 7th based on reading her stuff that isn't a real way. I'll mention it just as a wobble point, because I think that the 7th is actually something they can fix. The other things are permanent. So she's right. There are 6 permanent ones. So she called them character shields. I call them character shields. I don't remember what she called them. Vulnerability shields or something like that. But the first one, and there's the book I think of hers that goes into it the most, if you want to read more, is called Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. But anyway, she talks about these different shields. So I'll give you an example. In fact, I happen to really like the TV series Friends. I know that some people don't like that, but if you look at the TV series Friends, they have 6 iconic characters, okay? Those 6 characters each exhibit one of these 6 shields that she talked about. So since I'm doing it in the interest of time, I probably have like -6 minutes remaining. So I'll just say the first one is perfectionism, and I don't really have to say much more. That's Monica. And then the next one is numbing, and that's just really doing anything that distracts you. So it would be shopping, running. And a lot of these shields, people have a tendency to think that I'm talking about something bad. I'm not. These are ways that we protect ourselves from damage or protect ourselves when we're experiencing trauma. So they're all completely healthy until taken too far. So perfectionism, right? Totally fine. Get your ducks in a row, have some lists, be prepared until you cannot pass a pillow without fluffing it because your mom is coming. Now we've gotten into neurotic, right? We're harming ourselves or others by our crazy behavior. And then, so like numbing, same thing. You spend $300 for 2 paychecks, but you're fine. Binge watching Netflix sometimes, as long as you make it to work, probably fine. When you get into alcohol binging, drug binging, porn, strip clubs, hookers. I mean, we start to get into places where you can see that this can be damaging, but that one's clearly Joey. So he's like, you're going through a breakup. Let's go to a strip club or whatever. Let's watch this show may be born for like 30 hours. Okay. I'm going to eat 22 sandwiches. Not healthy. Okay. So, numbing can be unhealthy, obviously, too. Most of us numb, but for some people, it will be their primary shield, right? So I want to make that difference because we'll all numb some. And then the other one that, will be an obvious, this is mine. So Phoebe is an oversharer. So she'll have a tendency to be like, let me tell you this information. It's probably information that, I shouldn't really share with you at this point, but if I share it with you now and it's too much for you, you'll go away before it hurts my feelings, right? So that's how you protect yourself, by sharing too much, because you're like, hey, you don't like me? Let's find out right now. It can get really unhealthy when you start using it to try and get attention, especially if you're sharing things that aren't even true. So you'll meet people who are like, let me tell you about this and that I did, and they're like, how could that be? Weren't you in college then? Also, I went there to Botswana. It was great. But I thought you were at your parents' for Christmas. No, was I? Anyway, so, you've all met those people. They've taken this too far. Anyway, so they're just trying to get attention, right? And then the next one is Chandler, and it's criticism, cynicism, cruelty. If you've seen The Devil Wears Prada, the boss in that is criticism, cynicism, cruelty. So sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're just a-holes. My boss at a law firm, most all of them. And so then you can move to, who am I missing? I'm missing Rachel. So Rachel's a serpentiner. She just puts stuff off. It's the people who, my husband's a serpentiner. So you have like oversharer, and then you have my serpentining husband. So you can see that at like, anytime I need to find something out, I'm like, honey, did you answer? Why didn't you answer? What about this? What about this? And he's like, I feel like I'm being interrogated. I'm like, why won't you answer? Right. So we're an interesting two to put together. And I can't remember if I missed anyone. Did I miss anyone? Oh, Ross. Is promoting joy. Rehearsing tragedy. So he's the person, they tend to be anxiety or preppers or whatever. They'll literally like stand over their baby's crib and they're like, the baby's sleeping. I should sleep, but I'm worried. What if she rolls over and suffocates? What if, this happens? What if a fire starts? What if, those are those people. They're always worried and second guessing and making follow-up plans for their follow-up plans. That's those people. And so they take these moments that should be happy and joyful and they ruin them because they're constantly trying to think of a contingency plan. And the only other one I didn't mention is victim Viking. And that one is basically, you see the whole world as either being conquerors or you're being taken advantage of. And it sort of warps your worldview. That's the one that I was saying, I think that becomes your shield, where you feel like you either have to take advantage of someone or be taken advantage of. So you're always very proactive and you tend to be like a taker to protect yourself so you don't have things taken from you. But that one is also can be a character misconception. So from a book perspective, they could learn not to use that shield in an unhealthy way over the course of the book. Anyway, I take all those elements and I put them together and I just start saying, where's the conflict? What would happen next? And when I don't know what to do, I go back to my character stuff. What's my character's problem? How would they shield? What can I have happen? These three things? Okay, let's pick this one because that would help them get closer or further from their goal depending on where I need to be for the plot. And that's it. I think it's actually pretty easy to explain in 10 minutes. But you have to then assemble all of those tools and use them to make the house. So,
Well, you've obviously done a lot of research on the craft of writing, especially on plotting and character. Have you ever considered writing your own and publishing your own book on the craft of writing and plotting?
So I did write a book when I taught the class, the outlining class. I wrote a book for it because I'm super visual. So I process things a lot better if I've read them. So I wrote a book and just gave it to everybody. I haven't published it. I just gave it to everyone who was in the class. So I've written one, but I haven't ever put one out. I feel like to put one out, I would have to be saying this is worth something. And I'm always happy to share. So I do I pick a person or two and mentor them every month for free because I had a lot of people who helped me out when I first started. And I feel like, at least to me, I feel like some of that stuff should be free. Maybe I should put the plot one out and just make it free. And then people can just download it if they want it. But yeah, I have it. I just haven't done anything with it.
Well, if you do that, we'll link to it in the show notes when this episode comes out. But I'll follow up with you before we do.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. I just have too much guilt. I feel like I would feel bad trying to charge authors for something that I'm happy to give them,
It's very kind of you.
Well, I sort of operate under the philosophy that I used to think, I just don't think books are zero sum. I think that our competition is actually Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime or whatever. I think our competition is other media. So I think good books make more readers. So I'm always in the mindset of any new good books that I find, any good writers that I find, I want to push their stuff to my readers, to everybody else, because I think reading good content makes people want to read more and makes them want to talk to other people and convince them to read. So I think good books are good for everyone.
Yeah, that's such a good point. There's so much competition now for our reading time, like whether it's like TV, podcasts, everything. There's just not enough time to consume all the media that I want to consume.
Right. I have the same problem. I'm like, man, the day is over and I haven't binge watched or binge read anything. Like, what was I doing with my day?
Well, we've kept you for a long time now, Bridget, so thank you so much for chatting with us. But before we let you go, I wanted to hear about what you're working on next.
So I have a bunch of series under Bridget E. Baker, my fantasy stuff. I have like 3 in process right now, which is a big, long mess. But I only have 3 series, period, under B.E. Baker. And so I decided that wasn't enough. I'm actually writing what will be a new first in series. So I finished off my best-selling series is the Birch Creek Ranch series that starts with the bequest. I'm starting off a series that's going to be kind of like that. I'm calling it The Irish Escape is going to be the series name. And it's going to start with a book called The Crumbly Old Castle. So I'm writing that one right now. It's been fun. It's just, I plot out my series before I start writing. So my kids and my husband are like, how many words have you written? I'm like, 0. And they're like, what? Isn't it due at the end of the year? I'm like, yes, but I'm still working on my series outline. And they're like, why? I said, well, there's 3 point of view characters, the women, because it's a women's fiction, but all my women's fiction has a lot of romance. So my readers usually just call it a romance, but it's not. In fact, in the bequest, there isn't a single kiss. I'm like, I don't think you can really call that a romance. It has 2 female points of view and not even a kiss. But the book series, of course, has a lot of romance in it. So this one is these 3 women who actually rode horses together all through high school. They were at the same barn, so they were best friends. And then one of them stayed put in Florida and the other 2 moved. One moved to Colorado and one moved to, I haven't picked, but probably Austin, Texas. And so one of them is in a marriage. And this was the one that really, there's usually one character that really speaks to me before I get the idea for the story. And this one was a lady who is super organized. In fact, when I dropped a sample chapter in my reader group, they were like, we thought we were reading you. We thought this was just a post from you. I'm like, oh, heavens, no. Sorry, honey. But in my thing, the characters, like, I never drop balls. I never mix anything up. I have everything running perfectly. Every year we do this girls' trip with these 2, best friends of mine from the barn when we were in high school. And so, she literally goes to the airport and realizes that she had the day wrong. So she's supposed to leave the next day. She gets there and her flight is not taking off. So she had taken an Uber, so no one would have to go pick her up either. She has to take an Uber back to her house. When she gets there, she finds that her husband is sleeping with someone. And so she thinks, based on who she's always been, that she would walk in and scream and what's happening? And instead she just quietly turns around and goes to a hotel for the night and leaves and goes on her girls' trip. And she's like, I don't have the wherewithal to tell anybody about this. I don't have the wherewithal to talk about it. It guts her. She doesn't know what to do. And she comes from, and this is, by the way, nothing like me. My parents are disgustingly happily married still, and they're not young. But she came from a home that was what I would call a broken home. It's her dad has been married and divorced 8 times, and her mom's been married or divorced twice, and so she's on her 3rd marriage. So she doesn't want to just say, I'm just going to give up, like she feels like her parents always did. So this first book is really, during this girls' trip, it's her processing what she's going to do. Because I got the idea, because I was like, what would happen if when something like that happened, you could hit the pause button and be like, what do I want to do here? And you don't have to make, because I always make decisions in 2 seconds. And I think this character does too. And this is one of those where she's like, I'm not going to make the decision in 2 seconds. And she's someone who, once she tells people, then she's got to do something about it. So she doesn't even tell her friends. She's trying to decide what to do with her marriage. And it's called The Crumbly Old Castle. She ends up, The Irish Escape is the series title. So you kind of have a spoiler there on what she's going to decide. But she ends up moving to Ireland and starting a bed and breakfast with horseback riding in Ireland. And she has to haul her kids over there. And she expects that her 2 friends will want nothing to do with it. And actually, both of them decide to go. So by the end of the first book, all 3 of these women will decide to move to Ireland and work together on a business enterprise in their 40s. So they're going to be 40, 41, something like that. And they're all going to kind of be starting over. And so that's sort of what this series, and my last series, The Birch Creek Ranch, is about them starting over, but on a ranch. So I wanted to do something similar, but different women, different circumstances, and a new place. I've had to do so much research on Ireland. I was like, oh my gosh, my husband's making fun of me. He's like, I watched an Irish movie. It was the weirdest movie I have ever seen. It's hailed as the best Irish romance. It's called Wild Mountain Thyme. I'm going to ruin it for all of you. This main character guy is 35, and so is the girl. They grew up together. She's been in love with him all along. He's never proposed. She has brought it up many times that she'll only marry him and wants to marry him and blah, blah, blah. Finally, at the end of the movie, after we've been tortured through like a month and a half, all these people die. Her mom dies. His dad dies. He still won't propose. I'm like, what is happening here? And they're not even dating. They're not together. They just live next door. Finally, at the end, do you know what? Spoiler. Do you know what his problem was for 30 years? Why he never was interested in her?
Why?
He believes he's a honeybee.
I did not see that coming.
I was just about to say that.
That was see that coming.
The twist I really did not see coming.
I was like, this makes my hamburger enchilada look like a freaking taco. Like, what that? You think you're a honeybee? And he's like, I told another woman and she just left me. And I'm like, and the main character says what I said, which is, what does that mean though? Like, you don't make honey. You don't live in a hive. You run a farm. And he's like, I just think you're the most beautiful flower. And she's like, and so then they get married and they're doing karaoke and the dead people that had died are there in the scene singing with them. And I can't tell whether they came back to life or this is an Irish thing. I was like, I have more I need to learn about Ireland.
Maybe go to Ireland instead of watching these movies.
I straight up wrote my Dragon Shifter book series in Iceland and then went to Iceland with my family. And now I told my husband, I'm like, we're going to be going to Ireland this coming spring. So we have an Ireland trip planned, but I have to write the first book now. So I'm like, I need to find out some stuff so that this makes sense because I have no idea what just happened with this movie. Anyway, but it's listed on a bunch of places like the best Irish romance. And I'm like, I'm thinking my book will not be big in Ireland and I'm okay with that. But I need to figure out some more about their culture because this makes no sense to me.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, I have never watched a movie or read a book where someone thought they were a bee. So that's new to me.
So there was their big twist. I don't feel like that was plotted. That feels like when my character woke up in the middle of the book and was like, I was dreaming. I'm actually living on Earth. I'm like, okay. Anyway, it was a weird movie.
And one last question that we like to ask before we let you go. Where can our listeners find you online?
Oh, I'm on Facebook. I'm actually pretty good on Facebook because it's just randomly talking and saying oddball things like I think I'm a honeybee, which I, by the way, would have busted out with at 6 instead of 35, clearly as an overshare. But I'm also doing a very poor job on Instagram, if you like Instagram. And I am on TikTok. On pretty much everything is Bridget E. Baker. And you can find, I have a Facebook reader group as well. And I have a website. And then you can find me on Kobo. And all my stuff, all my books and all my audio are in Kobo Plus. So if you're a Kobo Plus listener or reader, you can definitely get them all there and not even have to pay for it.
Love to hear that.
Excellent. Well, Bridget, thank you so much for hanging out and chatting with us today. And we will link to all of your socials and your books and the craft books you recommended in our show notes. So listeners can find them.
Good. Perfect.
And
thank you so much. You guys have a good afternoon.
You too.
Thanks, Bridget. Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in picking up Bridget's books, we will include links in our show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us at KoboWritingLife.com. Be sure to follow us on social media. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook and Twitter and at kobo.writing.life on Instagram and Threads.
This episode was hosted by Laura Granger and Rachel Wharton with production by Terrence Abrahams. Editing is provided by Kelly Robothon. Our theme music is composed by Tearjerker, and a huge thanks to Bridget for being our guest today. If you're ready to start your publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.